The mess hall froze the second she stepped in. A woman, quiet, composed, eating alone like she'd done this a million times before. But in a prison like this, a calm woman is the easiest target, or at least, that's what 4 inmates thought. They spotted her tray, her silence, her sighs, and grinned like they'd just found tonight's entertainment. One blocked her path. Another kicked the bench beside her. A third yanked her tray away. The fourth leaned in and whispered, "You're in the wrong place, sweetheart." She didn't respond, didn't plead, didn't even look up. She just exhaled, slow, steady, like she was measuring the room and timing their heartbeat. The first inmate reached for her hair. The second laughed. The third cracked his knuckles. The fourth told her she had 10 seconds to move. She didn't get to 9, because the moment his hand brushed her shoulder, the entire mess hall heard a sound they'd never heard from a woman before. The precise, surgical violence of someone who'd been trained to break men twice her size. In 45 seconds, one inmate was on the floor choking for air. Another's arm bent in a direction arms don't bend. The third slammed unconscious against a table, and the fourth, he was screaming for guards to save him. Only then did everyone understand why she moved like a ghost and struck like a machine. She wasn't weak, she wasn't scared. She was a former Navy SEAL, and they had just awakened the wrong warrior. Stay with me until the end, because what she did after those 45 seconds shocked every inmate, every guard, and changed her entire prison forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. Her name was Elena Rodriguez, and 3 months earlier, she had walked through the gates of Millfield Correctional Facility, wearing standard-issue orange jumpsuit number 47291. The prison processing officer had glanced at her paperwork, noted her height at 5'4", her weight at 125 pounds, and marked her down as low risk. What he didn't know was that Elena had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, completing missions in locations that didn't exist on any official map. Her file contained nothing about the months she'd spent in underwater demolition training, the classified operations in hostile territories, or the fact that she could neutralize threats with her bare hands before most people could even process what was happening. The reason Elena was in prison wasn't because she was a criminal by nature. She was serving a 2-year sentence for assault charges that stemmed from an incident at a bar where she'd defended herself against 3 men who thought they could take advantage of a woman drinking alone. The judge had called her response excessive force, but anyone who knew her background understood that Elena had actually shown remarkable restraint that night. Prison life had been surprisingly peaceful for Elena during her first 3 months. She kept to herself, followed the rules, and avoided the drama that seemed to follow other inmates. She spent her time reading books from the prison library, writing letters to her sister, and maintaining the physical fitness routine that had been drilled into her during her military service. But peace in prison is a fragile thing, and Elena knew it wouldn't last forever. The 4 inmates who had decided to target her that day were exactly the type of predators that made prison dangerous for anyone they perceived as vulnerable. Marcus Thompson was the unofficial leader of their group, a man serving 15 years for armed robbery who had built his reputation by intimidating smaller inmates. At 6'2" and 220 pounds, he was used to getting his way through physical intimidation. His closest associate was Danny Walsh, a career criminal with multiple convictions for assault and battery. Danny had learned early in his prison career that violence was the currency that bought respect, and he'd been eager to prove himself worthy of Marcus's inner circle. The third member of their group was Kevin Torres, a man whose anger issues had landed him in prison after a bar fight that left another man hospitalized. Kevin was known for his unpredictable temper and his willingness to escalate any situation into violence. The fourth member was the youngest, Ryan Mitchell, a 22-year-old serving time for drug trafficking charges. Ryan was trying to prove himself to the older inmates and saw attacking Elena as his opportunity to earn respect and protection within their group. They had been watching Elena for weeks, noting her quiet demeanor and the way she seemed to avoid confrontation. In their experience, women who acted like Elena were either scared or weak, and either option made them perfect targets for the kind of harassment that would establish dominance and entertain the group. What they didn't understand was that Elena's quiet behavior wasn't fear, it was discipline. Her military training had taught her to observe, assess, and prepare before taking any action. She had noticed their attention weeks ago and had been mentally preparing for the inevitable confrontation. On that particular Tuesday morning, Elena had entered the mess hall at her usual time, collected her standard breakfast of scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee, and found her preferred seat in the corner where she could observe the entire room while keeping her back to the wall. The mess hall at Millfield housed nearly 400 inmates during breakfast hours, creating a chaotic environment filled with conversations, arguments, and the constant tension that came from putting dangerous people in close proximity. Most inmates formed alliances or gangs for protection, but Elena had chosen to remain independent, relying on her training and instincts rather than seeking safety in numbers. She had been eating quietly for about 10 minutes when she noticed Marcus and his group approaching her table. Their body language told her everything she needed to know about their intentions. Marcus walked with the swagger of someone who expected others to move out of his way. Danny kept his hands loose at his sides like he was ready for a fight. Kevin's jaw was clenched in barely controlled anger, and Ryan looked nervous but determined. Elena continued eating, but every sense was now on high alert. She was tracking their movement, calculating distances, identifying potential weapons within reach, and planning multiple response scenarios based on how the situation might unfold. When Marcus stopped directly in front of her table and kicked the bench beside her, Elena knew the confrontation had officially begun. She could have tried to diffuse the situation with words, but her experience told her that men like Marcus weren't interested in reasonable conversation. They were looking for dominance, and they would continue escalating until they got the violent confrontation they wanted. The moment Danny yanked her tray away, sending her breakfast scattering across the floor, Elena made her decision. These men had crossed the line from intimidation to actual aggression, and her military training kicked into full gear. When Kevin leaned in and whispered his threat about her being in the wrong place, Elena's mind shifted into what her SEAL instructors had called combat mode. Time seemed to slow down as her brain processed every detail of her environment, from the position of each attacker to the location of nearby guards, to the reactions of the other inmates who were starting to notice the confrontation. Ryan's declaration that she had 10 seconds to move was the final warning Elena needed. She knew that whatever was about to happen would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation, but her entire future in this prison. Elena's eyes locked onto Marcus's hand as it moved toward her shoulder. In that split second, her mind calculated everything: distance, angles, force required, exit strategies. Her body coiled like a spring, every muscle fiber responding to years of training that had been burned into her nervous system. The first move was simple, classic, devastating. As Marcus's fingers made contact with her shoulder, Elena's left hand shot up and trapped his wrist against her body. Simultaneously, her right elbow drove backward into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The impact expelled every molecule of air from his lungs in a single violent rush. Marcus doubled over, his face turning purple as his diaphragm spasmed uncontrollably. But Elena wasn't finished with him. She pivoted on her left foot, using Marcus's forward momentum against him, and swept his legs with a technique that would have impressed her old instructors. His massive frame hit the concrete floor with a sound like a sack of cement dropping from a great height. The entire mess hall felt the impact through the ground. Danny Walsh had been laughing at what he thought was going to be easy entertainment. His laughter died in his throat as he watched his crew's leader crumple like paper. But Danny was a fighter, and his instincts kicked in fast. He lunged forward, throwing a wild haymaker aimed at Elena's head. Elena saw the punch coming before Danny had even decided to throw it. She ducked under his swinging arm and grabbed his extended wrist with both hands. In one fluid motion, she stepped forward and twisted his arm behind his back, applying pressure to his shoulder joint in a direction nature never intended. The sound Danny made wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of a grown man realizing that his arm was about to separate from his shoulder if he moved even an inch. Elena held him there for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to understand that she could permanently disable him whenever she chose. Then she released the pressure and shoved him away from her. Danny stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, his face white with shock and pain. Kevin Torres had been frozen with disbelief, watching his 2 partners get dismantled by a woman half their size. But Kevin's anger was his defining characteristic, and it overrode his survival instincts. He grabbed a plastic cafeteria tray from a nearby table, planning to use it as a weapon. Elena turned to face him just as he raised the tray above his head. She stepped inside his reach before he could bring it down, drove her palm into his sternum with enough force to stop his heart for a beat, then grabbed his shirt and used his own weight to throw him over her hip. Kevin's body flew through the air and crashed into an empty table, sending chairs scattering in every direction. The back of his head connected with the table's edge, and he slumped to the floor, unconscious before he even knew what had happened to him. The entire sequence had taken less than 20 seconds. Ryan Mitchell was the only one left standing, and every instinct in his young body was screaming at him to run. But running would mean admitting defeat in front of 400 inmates who were now watching in stunned silence. His reputation would be destroyed forever. So Ryan did the worst possible thing he could have done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sharpened piece of metal that he'd fashioned into a crude knife. The moment Elena saw the weapon, something changed in her eyes. The controlled violence she'd used on the first 3 men had been measured, designed to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. But a knife changed everything. A knife meant lethal intent, and lethal intent triggered a different set of responses that had been programmed into her during the most classified portions of her military training. Elena moved forward instead of backward, closing the distance between herself and the weapon before Ryan could process what was happening. Her left hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, controlling the knife hand, while her right hand struck his throat with precisely calibrated force. Ryan's eyes went wide as his airway constricted. The improvised weapon clattered to the floor as his hands instinctively moved to his throat. Elena maintained her grip on his wrist and spun him around, applying a blood choke that would render him unconscious in seconds without causing permanent harm. As Ryan's body went limp in her arms, Elena gently lowered him to the floor and stepped back from all 4 men. The mess hall was completely silent. 400 inmates, dozens of guards, kitchen staff, and administrative personnel stood frozen, trying to process what they had just witnessed. A woman weighing 125 pounds had just systematically dismantled 4 men with a combined weight of over 800 pounds, and she had done it with a level of skill and precision that defied belief. But what happened next was what truly shocked everyone in that room. Elena calmly walked back to where her tray had been knocked to the floor. She picked up her fallen fork, retrieved what remained of her scrambled eggs, and sat back down at her table. She resumed eating her breakfast as if nothing had happened. The silence stretched on for another 10 seconds before the reality of the situation finally registered with the guards. Whistles started blowing. Radios crackled to life, and suddenly the mess hall erupted into organized chaos as correctional officers rushed to secure the scene. But Elena continued eating, completely calm, completely composed, while chaos swirled around her. Captain Sarah Morrison was the first senior officer to reach the scene. She'd been a corrections officer for 15 years and had seen every type of prison violence imaginable, but she'd never seen anything like this. 4 of the prison's most dangerous inmates were scattered across the floor, all of them neutralized by a woman who was now sitting peacefully at her table finishing her breakfast. Morrison approached Elena's table cautiously, her hand resting on her radio. "Rodriguez, I need you to stand up slowly and put your hands behind your back." Elena looked up at the captain with eyes that were completely clear and focused. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly, and stood up with her hands already moving to the small of her back. As Morrison applied the handcuffs, she noticed something that would stick with her for the rest of her career. Elena's hands weren't shaking. Her breathing was completely normal. There wasn't even a drop of sweat on her forehead. This woman had just engaged in violent combat against 4 men, and she looked like she'd been sitting in a library reading a book. Morrison had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the difference between someone who had gotten lucky in a fight and someone who possessed genuine, professional-level combat skills. What she'd witnessed wasn't luck or adrenaline or desperation. It was mastery. As Captain Morrison escorted Elena toward the administrative wing, word of the incident was already spreading through the prison like wildfire. Inmates who had witnessed the confrontation were whispering in hushed tones to those who had missed it. Guards were radioing details to their supervisors. Kitchen staff were recounting what they'd seen to anyone who would listen. But Elena walked through the corridors in complete silence, her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls with mechanical precision. Other inmates pressed themselves against their cell doors to catch a glimpse of the woman who had just rewritten the rules of prison hierarchy in less than a minute. Warden James Patterson had been running Millfield Correctional Facility for 12 years. He'd dealt with riots, stabbings, drug trafficking, gang wars, and every other form of violence that could occur within prison walls. But when Captain Morrison's initial report came through his radio, he had to ask her to repeat it 3 times. A 125-pound woman had single-handedly defeated 4 of the prison's most dangerous inmates using what appeared to be military-grade combat techniques. Patterson had served in the Army himself before becoming a corrections officer, and he recognized the implications immediately. When Elena was brought into his office, still handcuffed but walking with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout the entire incident, Patterson studied her face carefully. He'd interrogated thousands of inmates over the years, and he could usually read guilt, fear, anger, or defiance in their expressions within seconds. Elena's face showed none of those emotions. She looked like a soldier reporting for duty. "Have a seat, Rodriguez," Patterson said, nodding to Morrison to remove the handcuffs. "Captain Morrison tells me you had an interesting breakfast this morning." Elena sat down with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap. "Yes, sir. 4 inmates initiated a confrontation. I defended myself using appropriate force to neutralize the threats they presented." The clinical precision of her language made Patterson's eyebrows rise. This wasn't how typical inmates described fights. This was how military personnel filed after-action reports. "Appropriate force?" Patterson asked. "Rodriguez, you put 4 men in the infirmary. One of them has a concussion. Another one's shoulder is dislocated. The third one couldn't breathe properly for 20 minutes. And the 4th one is still unconscious." Elena's expression didn't change. "Sir, all 4 men will make full recoveries within a matter of days or weeks. Given their size advantage and the fact that one of them produced an improvised weapon, I used the minimum force necessary to ensure my own safety." Patterson leaned back in his chair. In 12 years as warden, he'd never heard an inmate refer to a sharpened piece of metal as an improvised weapon. He'd never heard anyone describe a prison fight in terms of neutralizing threats or appropriate force. "Rodriguez, I need to ask you a direct question, and I need you to give me a direct answer. What's your military background?" For the first time since entering his office, Elena hesitated, not because she was trying to decide whether to lie, but because she was calculating how much truth she could reveal without compromising classified information. "I served 8 years in the Navy, sir. I was honorably discharged 2 years ago." "What was your rating?" Elena paused again. "Special operations, sir. I'm not authorized to discuss the specific details of my service record." Patterson felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Special operations. Combat techniques that looked like something out of a military training manual. The calm professionalism that remained intact, even after violent confrontation. "Were you a SEAL, Rodriguez?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I'm not authorized to confirm or deny involvement in any classified military programs." But her non-answer was answer enough. Patterson had dealt with former military personnel in his prison before. Marines, soldiers, airmen, and sailors who had struggled to adjust to civilian life after their service ended. But he'd never encountered anyone with Elena's apparent level of training and skill. "This presents a problem," Patterson said finally. "What happened in that mess hall this morning is going to change your entire experience in this facility. Every inmate who was there is going to spread the story. Within 24 hours, everyone in this prison is going to know exactly what you're capable of." Elena nodded. "I understand, sir." "Do you? Because I'm not sure you do. You just became the most famous inmate in this entire facility. Some people are going to be afraid of you. Others are going to want to test themselves against you. The gang leaders are going to see you as either a valuable asset or a dangerous threat." Patterson stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the prison yard. "In my experience, there are two types of inmates who end up in situations like yours. The first type gets overwhelmed by the attention and makes mistakes that extend their sentences or get them seriously hurt. The second type figures out how to use their reputation constructively." Elena remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I'm hoping you're the second type, Rodriguez, because if you are, you might actually be able to do some good in this place." Meanwhile, in the prison infirmary, the 4 men Elena had defeated were slowly coming to terms with what had happened to them. Marcus Thompson was the first to regain full consciousness, though his ribs ached with every breath and his pride hurt worse than his body. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the prison's head medical officer, had been treating combat injuries for nearly a decade, but she'd never seen anything quite like what Elena had done. Each of the 4 men had been injured in precisely the right way to disable them without causing permanent damage. "This is professional work," she told her assistant while examining Marcus's x-rays. "Whoever did this knew exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly where to strike, exactly how to control the amount of damage inflicted." Danny Walsh was awake, but still unable to move his shoulder without excruciating pain. The way Elena had manipulated his arm had stretched his shoulder joint to its absolute limit without actually tearing any ligaments. It was a technique that required years of training to execute properly. Kevin Torres had regained consciousness with a splitting headache and no clear memory of how he'd ended up unconscious on the infirmary bed. The last thing he remembered was raising a tray above his head, planning to bring it down on Elena's skull. Ryan Mitchell was the most shaken of the 4. The memory of Elena's hand around his throat, the controlled way she'd rendered him unconscious, had left him with a deep understanding that he'd come much closer to death than he'd realized at the time. "She could have killed all of us," Ryan whispered to Marcus when the medical staff was out of earshot. "The way she moved, the way she controlled everything. She wasn't just fighting us, she was teaching us a lesson." Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to maintain his reputation as the toughest inmate in the facility, but he couldn't deny what his body was telling him. Elena Rodriguez possessed skills that none of them had ever encountered before. "What do we do now?" Danny asked, wincing as he tried to adjust his position on the hospital bed. It was a question that went far beyond their immediate situation. The 4 men had built their entire prison identities around being predators, men who could intimidate and control others through the threat of violence. But Elena had demonstrated that there were levels of violence and skill that they couldn't even comprehend, let alone match. Back in the general population, word of the mess hall incident was spreading through the complex social networks that governed prison life. Inmates who had witnessed the confrontation were describing Elena's techniques to those who had missed it. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core message remained consistent. A woman had just redefined what was possible within these walls. Cell Block D housed some of the prison's most dangerous inmates, including several gang leaders who controlled various aspects of the facility's underground economy. The news of Elena's demonstration had reached them within hours, and they were all asking the same question. What did this mean for the existing power structure? Tommy "Ice" Williams ran the largest gang in the prison, controlling drug distribution and protection rackets through a network of loyal followers. He'd built his empire by being smarter and more ruthless than his competitors, but he'd never encountered anyone like Elena Rodriguez. "Bring me everything we talked to have on this woman," he told his lieutenant, a scarred man named Carlos, who had served as Tommy's enforcer for 3 years. "I want to know her background, her connections, her weaknesses. I want to know why she's here and when she's getting out." But information about Elena was surprisingly difficult to come by. Her prison file contained the basic facts about her conviction and sentence, but there were gaps that suggested portions of her background had been classified or sealed. Her military service record was almost entirely redacted, with only her rank and discharge status visible. What Tommy and the other gang leaders were beginning to understand was that Elena Rodriguez represented something completely new in their carefully ordered world. She wasn't affiliated with any existing group. She wasn't seeking protection or alliance, and she possessed capabilities that could potentially disrupt everything they'd worked to build. In Cell Block A, where the prison housed its female inmates, word of Elena's actions had created a completely different type of reaction. Many of the women had been victims of violence themselves, either before their incarceration or during their time in prison. The idea that one of their own had successfully defended herself against multiple male attackers was inspiring in ways that transcended the usual prison politics. Maria Santos, who was serving time for defending herself against an abusive boyfriend, found herself crying when she heard the story. "Finally," she whispered to her cellmate, "finally, someone showed them that we're not all victims." But Elena's demonstration had also created new dangers for the female inmates. Some of the male inmates who felt humiliated by what had happened in the mess hall were looking for ways to restore their damaged reputations, and targeting other women seemed like the easiest path to reclaiming their sense of dominance. The ripple effects of those 45 seconds were only just beginning to spread through every corner of Millfield Correctional Facility, and everyone from the warden to the newest inmates was trying to figure out what Elena Rodriguez's presence would mean for their own survival. What none of them realized yet was that Elena's real mission inside the prison was just getting started. 3 days after the mess hall incident, Elena's real work inside Millfield began in earnest. What the warden, the guards, and every inmate didn't know was that her assault conviction was completely fabricated. Her presence in this prison wasn't punishment. It was an assignment. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just a former Navy SEAL. She was an active intelligence operative working under the deepest possible cover. The Department of Justice had been investigating corruption within Millfield for 18 months, but every attempt to gather evidence from the outside had failed. Guards were being bribed. Evidence was disappearing. Witnesses were being intimidated or worse. The only way to expose the truth was to insert someone on the inside, someone with the skills to survive in the most dangerous environment imaginable while gathering intelligence that could bring down an entire network of corruption, stretching from the prison walls to the governor's office. Elena's mission parameters were crystal clear. Identify the key players in the smuggling operation that was moving drugs, weapons, and contraband through the prison. Document the guards who were being paid to look the other way. Find evidence of the systematic violence being used to silence potential witnesses, and do it all while maintaining her cover as a convicted felon serving her sentence. The mess hall confrontation hadn't been part of the plan, but it had given her something she couldn't have achieved through months of careful relationship building, instant credibility and respect from every inmate in the facility. Elena's cell was in Block C, strategically chosen because it provided access to the main corridors, where most of the prison's illegal activities took place. Her cellmate was a woman named Jennifer Kim, serving a 5-year sentence for embezzlement. Jennifer was quiet, kept to herself, and had never been involved in any of the prison's underground networks, which made her perfect for Elena's purposes. "You're different from the other inmates," Jennifer said on their 4th night together, lying on her bottom bunk while Elena sat on the floor doing push-ups with mechanical precision. "Most people here are either scared or angry all the time. You're just focused." Elena completed her set of 50 and moved into a plank position. "Everyone processes incarceration differently. I've learned to control what I can control and accept what I can't." "Is that something they taught you in the military?" Elena held her plank for exactly 60 seconds before responding. "Among other things." Jennifer had heard the stories about what happened in the mess hall. Everyone in the prison had heard them by now. But watching Elena maintain her physical conditioning with the same discipline she'd shown during the confrontation, Jennifer was beginning to understand that those stories might actually be understated. "Are you planning to cause more trouble?" Jennifer asked. Elena moved into a series of stretches that would have impressed a yoga instructor. "Trouble finds everyone in here eventually. The question is whether you're prepared when it arrives." What Jennifer didn't know was that Elena spent every moment outside their cell gathering intelligence on the prison's power structure. During meals, she observed who sat where and who controlled the flow of conversation. During recreation periods, she noted which guards were positioned, where and how they interacted with specific inmates. During work assignments, she documented the routes used to move supplies and identified potential security vulnerabilities. The prison's library became Elena's primary intelligence hub. As one of the few inmates with a college education and military background, she had been assigned to help with administrative tasks that gave her access to records, schedules, and personnel information that most inmates never saw. Librarian Mrs. Patterson was a civilian employee who had worked at Millfield for 7 years. She was honest, hard-working, and completely unaware that the prison's administration was systematically compromised. She also had access to files and databases that contained exactly the type of information Elena needed. "Rodriguez, you're the most organized volunteer I've ever had," Mrs. Patterson said, as Elena finished cataloging a shipment of new books with military efficiency. "Have you considered studying library science when you get out? You'd be excellent at it." Elena smiled genuinely for the first time since entering the prison. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll definitely consider it." Elena Rodriguez completed her mission 6 months later. The corruption network she exposed reached from the prison yard to the state capitol, resulting in 17 arrests, including 3 high-ranking officials. The 4 inmates who confronted her that morning, they became her most unlikely allies, helping gather evidence that brought down the smuggling operation they had unknowingly been part of. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one sitting quietly in the corner, eating breakfast like they've done it 1,000,000 times before.